Is the U.S. government preparing to buy 1 million Bitcoin? Top crypto industry executives met with U.S. Congress members on Tuesday, September 16th, to attend a roundtable on Capitol Hill to discuss the Bitcoin Act, which would see the U.S. government buy a whopping 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years using budget-neutral strategies. These crypto executives included both Tom Lee and Michael Saylor, who was locked in and laser-eyed on this massive development. Meeting with these executives were members of Congress that included both Cynthia Lummis, senator from Wyoming, and Nick Begich, representative of Alaska, sponsors of two nearly identical Senate and House bills calling for the acquisition of 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. The Senate bill has 5 co-sponsors and is currently sitting with the Senate Banking Committee, while the House bill has 9 co-sponsors and is currently sitting with the House Financial Services Committee. The purpose of this bill? Potentially changing the course of the national debt of the United States, as Michael Saylor outlined in this presentation from March for the Bitcoin Policy Institute.
So how should the U.S. pursue a Bitcoin strategy? Well, Senator Lummis has given us a clear guideline with the Bitcoin Act in Nashville in July. And what the Bitcoin Act said, it said, let's acquire 1 million Bitcoin over a 5-year period in a programmatic, disciplined fashion, transparent to all. And so let's consider the consequences of this strategy. Well, first of all, last week, the president signed the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Act or order. If we hold that 200,000 Bitcoin for the next 20 years, even though you see a flat line on the screen, the flat line is worth $3 trillion. So that's the value of doing nothing. Sometimes people think that you have to do something to make money. Sometimes the absence of doing awful and stupid things is making money. Doing stuff is highly overrated if the stuff is trading or selling your Bitcoin. The Lummis bill would acquire 1 million Bitcoin or 1.2 million Bitcoin. If you look at the consequences of that over the time frame, it's worth $16 trillion to the nation. If you get a bit more aggressive and we go for another million Bitcoin, it's worth $34 trillion to the nation. In this case, there's a bit of reflexivity. If the United States starts to more aggressively stockpile Bitcoin, it's going to accelerate the growth of the network. It's going to accelerate capital flowing in the network. It's going to increase and expand the overall digital capital network. If we move to a triple max strategy, you'll end up with 4 million Bitcoin. That's worth $73 trillion to America. And of course, President Trump has laid out a guideline. We should be the superpower. If you want a superpower strategy, here's a superpower strategy. Acquire Bitcoin consistently. By the way, over what time frame? Consistently daily between now and the 0.99. 0.99 is January of the year 2035, the point at which 99% of the Bitcoin supply has been mined. The asset becomes effectively capped for all practical purposes, because the last 1% comes out over 100 years. 0.99 between now and then, you've got 10 years for the digital gold rush. You should get your Bitcoin before there's no more Bitcoin for you. And you can see here, in this strategy, we acquire it consistently, and then we use surpluses from the U.S. government to continue to save in Bitcoin. It's worth $106 trillion to the United States. And so what does that look like? Well, the Lummis plan, which is grand, is modest in some ways, and a modest strategic Bitcoin reserve plan neutralizes the national debt. Sometimes doing modest things are actually brilliant, as long as you do the thing. It's like the people that bought just a little bit of Bitcoin in 2012. It was a modest investment. It made them billionaires. A modest thing 20 years in advance is a brilliant thing. If you're more aggressive, the triple max plan negates the national debt. The superpower plan creates a global superpower. We bought 78% of the United States for $40 million. $40 million purchased nearly 80% of this country. Think about it for a second. Bitcoin is the greatest opportunity of the 21st century, right? It's worth anywhere from $3 trillion to $106 trillion, depending upon how programmatic and aggressive we want to pursue this opportunity. These opportunities don't come along often. This is the once-in-a-century opportunity.
As Michael Saylor outlined, passing the Bitcoin Act would represent a unique opportunity for the United States to offset a significant portion of its national debt and remains a top priority in Washington, according to Hailey Miller, Director of Government Relations and Public Policy at the Digital Power Network. This comes on the heels of the passage of both the Genius Act, regulating stablecoins, and the Clarity Act, passed by the House and set for a Senate vote by the end of September. Both bills have seen broad bipartisan support, with the Genius Act passing the Senate by a whopping 68 to 30 vote. But how receptive are lawmakers to making the bigger step of actively buying Bitcoin as a way of offsetting the U.S. national debt? Dan Ives, Managing Director of Wedbush Securities, was among those who met with lawmakers on Tuesday, gave his thoughts on CNBC.
You were down in D.C. yesterday, meeting with lawmakers to talk about crypto and crypto regulation. I know you put some pictures up on your social media. Yep. I'm not sure if you gave them to us yet, but it was you, it was Michael Saylor, it was Tom Lee, three obviously very notable crypto voices. What were you hearing from lawmakers? You met with lawmakers like Ted Cruz and Tim Scott, both senators.
Yeah, I mean, and we met with a number of senators as well as members of Congress. Look, our view, being down there in D.C., it's also about the Bitcoin reserve. It's the view that it's the legitimization of what's happening in crypto. And as industry leaders, of course, Michael Saylor, Tom Lee, and many others, this is not stopping. This is actually just the start. I could tell you as chairman of ACO, in our view of world and where everything's going from an authentication and human proof, Frank, this is just the start of what's not just on crypto, but it's AI and crypto. It's the intersection.
All right.
This is just the start is a sentiment that was echoed by Matt Pines, executive director of the Bitcoin Policy Institute, who compared the Bitcoin Act to Chekhov's gun being placed on the table in this interview.
The strategic Bitcoin reserve is the most sensitive element of the administration's crypto policy writ large, because I think it's seen by certain folks in the Treasury Department, maybe some folks at the White House, as kind of being the most kind of nonlinear policy move, right? A lot of these other things, like the Genius Act, one, everyone kind of understands, good for the dollar, good for America's debt servicing. Even Russia was sort of mad about how this might just be a rug pull on the debt markets. It's like pretty obvious the strategy of externalizing financial repression and, leveraging crypto networks, right, for U.S. strategic purposes. If you look at history, right, like any shift in monetary reserve assets is usually driven by massive geopolitical upheaval, and it's taken as a matter of like the most serious national strategic decision making. And so you don't just kind of like inch your way into that. It's usually preconditions are set and the political and geopolitical conditions have to be ripe for it to be a major move, right? It's not going to be as incremental as these other policy things where it's like, okay, lots of study reports, lots of congressional debate on different draft bills. It's going to be people putting a sort of Chekhov's gun on the table, and then everyone walks around and pretends the gun's not there until the end of, Act 3, when America has to pick up the gun. And so the gun has been placed on the table and all the characters are walking around and, mostly ignoring it. But now it's there. And so it's less of telling like a linear progression story like you tell in these other policy legislative initiatives where things get introduced, things get debated. It's more like, okay, if the government is actually going to decide to acquire a meaningful amount of Bitcoin as a strategic asset beyond just sort of pure symbolic kind of political signaling, that is a 0 to 1 moment. You can't undo that. And the political and geopolitical conditions have to be ripe. And I think the objective assessment situation is right now, it's not a strategic necessity, right? I think we've made the case that it's prudent to acquire a meaningful position in advance of when it's a strategic necessity. But that's a normative argument to try to convince the government they should get ahead of what, is usually done in extremis, right? But politics is politics, and geopolitics and the lessons of history tell us that usually these things happen when it's inevitable, right? The U.S. was being drained of its gold for years before they realized, like, we have to rug pull everyone. And that happened on a weekend at Camp David, right? And so there are many people probably credibly making the case for years, oh, no, this system doesn't seem sustainable. And then 3 or 4 more years go by, right? Before the political and the geopolitical conditions trigger national leadership to get around the table on a weekend and decide to do something quite dramatic. So we're not there yet, but you can see the conditions developing in that direction. Maybe they can forestall that, but now that Chekhov's gun has sort of been put on the table, it's a subject more of a behind the scenes discussion and debate than I think a whole lot of like incremental policy adjustments.
It's one thing to place the gun on the table, but will it actually be fired? At the end of last year, Anthony Scaramucci gave a big indication in this interview, signaling his belief that the votes are there.
Do you think we'll get a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Do you think that's a thing?
I do, actually.
What does that look like, do you think?
They've got the votes. Haggerty wants it. McCormick wants it.
They have the votes in the Senate, do you think?
I think so, yeah. There's 53.
Really?
I do think so, yes.
For like to her bill to get 1 million Bitcoin, right? That was her full bill,
yeah,
right?
Well,
to keep the 200,000 then.
This stuff gets horse traded. So you'll probably have 200 won't get sold. They'll probably buy another 400,000 or 500,000 Bitcoin.
What?
Over the next.
You
don't
think this
that's
is
going to
real?
happen?
Senator, talk about it.
Let me tell you why I think it will happen. Okay, Trump wants it to happen, and he's got the Senate Banking Committee. Tim Scott wants it to happen. He's going to be the chair of the Senate Banking Committee. Besant wants it to happen. If you're telling me there are no Democrats, and I don't believe this because a lot of Democrats voted for the Saab 121 bill. If you looked at the dispersion of vote, it was a bipartisan approval of that bill. And by the way, Ryan, it was if you were 40 or 50, let's say you were below the age of 60, you voted for the bill if you were a Democrat. If you were a fossil like Elizabeth Warren or Sherrod Brown, you voted against it. So if you're telling me there are no Democrats that are going to vote for that, then I'll say, okay, then we're not going to get it. But I don't see that. I think Ro Khanna would vote for it. I think there's a lot of Democrats that look at it and say, if Bitcoin is digital gold and we have $600 billion of gold on reserve at our bank, in the Federal Reserve Bank, you're telling me we couldn't put $75 to $100 billion of Bitcoin on reserve?
So what are my thoughts? I agree with Senator Lummis, Michael Saylor, and others that purchasing 1 million Bitcoin, in addition to the 200,000 seized Bitcoin that the U.S. already holds, represents a unique opportunity to offset the U.S. national debt. I also agree with Matt Pines that this is a uniquely asymmetric policy decision that is likely to be negotiated on the down low before seeing a sudden surge of momentum to passage. Things to keep an eye on. Watch for progress on the Senate passing the Clarity Act. While currently stalled in the Senate, both the Genius Act and the Clarity Act have seen broad bipartisan support, signaling a strong receptiveness to crypto legislation exists within both parties that bodes well for the Bitcoin Act. The polymarket odds for the Clarity Act signing into law this year has risen to 43%. Once this is resolved, crypto legislation is likely to shift focus to the Bitcoin Act. When the Clarity Act is signed, watch for progress on the bills passing the respective Senate and House committees. Watch for Democrat co-sponsors signing onto the bill, currently only Republican co-sponsors. Watch for geopolitical developments that may trigger Chekhov's gun being picked up, like tensions with China or Russia flaring up. Watch for developments in regards to Trump's Supreme Court tariffs appeal. If the Supreme Court upholds the tariffs, there will be a lot more money available for budget-neutral methods of acquiring Bitcoin. What does this mean for Bitcoin? The passage of the Bitcoin Act would represent a watershed moment in Bitcoin's history, legitimizing Bitcoin as a strategic asset worth actively accumulating. Watch out for a much broader adoption phase to begin almost instantaneously, with many other nation-states likely to join the U.S. in actively purchasing Bitcoin out of necessity. All price predictions and models, like the power law, are likely to break. All bets are likely to be off the table for Bitcoin's price. In conclusion, consider buying as much Bitcoin as you can before the potential moment of inevitability happens, where the U.S. starts actively accumulating Bitcoin. As always, this is not financial advice. This is entertainment education, where I share my own thoughts as a financially independent 30-something looking to help people who feel trapped by the modern financial system. If you enjoyed this video, please give me here at The Money Rebel a thumbs up, like, subscribe, and comment your own thoughts on this video. Also follow me on X, where I post daily at @the_money_rebel. And until next time, keep your eyes on the prize.